Right, good evening everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I think we're in for a very interesting evening talking about Glenn Gould and Natsume Soseki with our speaker today, Damien Flanagan. Some of you may have been here a few months ago when he launched his book on Mishima here. We haven't got copies of this, so if you want to buy it you'll have to go to the internet, but he gave a very interesting talk about Mishima. And I immediately urged him to come back as soon as he had something else to talk about. Let me give you a brief introduction to Damien. He actually studied Japanese at Cambridge for a bit, went on and did a PhD at Kobe University, and subsequently has been publishing books about Japanese literature, not only in English, but I think more often in Japanese. So if you're Japanese, you can find a number of his books in Japanese on the internet. So as well as Mishima, he has published well, in fact your first book, wasn't it, was a study of Natsume Soseki. Well, I think that's probably all we need to say, Damien, so I'll pass straight over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining me this evening. Yes, as Jason mentioned, he made the considerable mistake when I was last here in November of saying if there was anything else I wanted to talk about, I should come back. And anybody who knows me knows that the problem is usually getting me to shut up about my favourite subject. So I'm delighted to take up that offer. Thinking about what I might come back and talk about. There were lots of different things, but the one that jumped out at me was this quite extraordinary story of the connection between Glenn Gould, the famous Canadian pianist, and Natsume Soseki, the most famous Japanese writer of the modern age. I'm not quite, we were just discussing this beforehand, but it's quite hard to know amongst the people who are here today whether your interests lie more with Gould or with Soseki. I think we can take it that everybody Japanese here is more than familiar with Natsume Soseki. In fact, I'll start off with the first slide, I think, if I can remember how to master the
down arrow. Yeah,
Glenn Gould, Natsume Soseki, both posed in as if they're having a conversation together, which seems appropriate. Natsume Soseki, hugely famous and enduringly popular in Japan, but not very well known in the West, even to this day, despite numerous translations. I think one of the extraordinary things about this story is how it is that two people from completely different ages, from two completely different artistic mediums, and from two completely different cultures manage to enmesh and come together. It's an incredible story of essentially obsession on the part of Glenn Gould for 15 years of his life, from first coming in contact with Natsume Soseki. Gould became quite transfixed by Soseki. We know that he had more books in his library by Natsume Soseki than any other writer. And what's particularly extraordinary about this is that Glenn Gould had no particular interest in Japan. He never visited Japan. He was, I should say, famously shy of aeroplanes. Didn't like travelling abroad. From the age of, from his early 30s, he famously stopped performing in public and only did studio recordings of his works. So at the time he comes into contact with Natsume Soseki, he's basically committed to never actually going to Japan or pursuing an interest in that. Amazingly, when Gould died, it was discovered not only did he have all Soseki's works in his house, but he actually had copies of Soseki's books in Japanese. So the obsession, if you like, is such that even though we can't read Japanese, doesn't know Japanese. He actually wants to have the books in the original in his house. The other really interesting thing I think about it is that although Glenn Gould has been the subject of numerous books and indeed even films on the subjects, and he's a famously eccentric character, so someone whose personal quirks as a virtuoso musician, he famously had to sit on his own particular low-slung seat. He liked to soak his hands before performances. He used to dress in winter clothes. All these type of things are very well catalogued in the books and films that have been done about Gould. And yet, this crucial connection between Gould and Soseki tends not to get any attention. And that's for a good reason, because the books on Gould tend to be written by musicologists, people who don't, when they hit upon the fact that Gould was reading these books by Natsume Soseki, don't really know who Natsume Soseki is, and they certainly don't have the familiarity with Soseki that a Japanese audience certainly would have. In the, I'm going to move on in a moment to discuss the crucial book that affected Glenn Gould. But the third corner of this world of association between Gould and Soseki is this figure, Johann Sebastian Bach. Gould, just to give you a little bit of background of him as a virtuoso musician. He was born in 1932. He shoots to fame really at the age of 22 with his performance of Bach's Goldberg Variations, which at the time wasn't really a part of the piano repertoire. Gould takes this work and makes it a quite electrical performance. Gould's virtuoso skill was that he was able to strike the notes of the piano with incredible precision at a very, very high tempo. So he's able to take on technically difficult works, such as the Goldberg Variations. What's very interesting about Gould's lifespan is that he hits fame at this very early age of 22. He dazzles concert halls around the world, becomes enormously famous. But from his early 30s, he essentially turns his back on that. And he starts to satirize the pomposity of the classical musical world. He also sees himself as very much an all-round artist. He doesn't like just being categorized as a famous pianist. He wants to be seen as somebody who can also write and have profound ideas on art in general. He does broadcasting and makes documentaries on subjects which take his interest. At the age of 35, he hits upon Natsume Soseki. I'll explain a little bit later how that actually happened. But what's interesting is there's a 15-year period in which he is actively engaging with Natsume Soseki. And at the very end of his life, which was a short life, he died at the age of 50, in his penultimate year, he re-records the Goldberg Variations, which was the work which propelled him to fame in the first place. When he does that re-recording of them, it's a completely different recording to the one he'd initially done. It's much slower, it's more contemplative. He was looking for a much more spiritual calm, he said, when he did this recording. So I think what's a really interesting question is, and one which hasn't really been tackled in when musicologists tend to look at this subject, is to what extent is Soseki actually affecting Glenn Gould as a musician? That not just as somebody that he likes to read as a sort of, by the by, but actually as a creative and a performing artist. And what I want to suggest to you is Natsume Soseki is actually quite a crucial part of Glenn Gould's development during his career. Glenn Gould was, this is really the story of one particular book. Glenn Gould owned all Soseki's works in English translation, but it was this book, The Three-Cornered World, that Gould first encountered Soseki. And it was this book that became overwhelmingly his favourite book. He had, Gould had 4 copies of this in his house, including 2 in Japanese. He densely annotated the English translation of it. He also wrote 37 pages of notes on it. He loved it so much he read the entire novel out over the phone to the person closest to him during his life, his cousin. He recorded sections of it for a broadcast on Canadian radio. And just before he died, he was actually working on turning it into a radio play. It was to be called Shioda's Daughter. And famously, when he died, there were just 2 books by his bedside, this book and the Bible. So I think we can take it here. He was very, very interested in this book. What I find extraordinary about this story is I find it something as a story about books in general, almost, with this, because I find there something inspirational about the idea that Soseki in Japan, he writes the original work, which in Japanese is called Kusamakura. He writes it in 1906. It's essentially unknown in the West until the mid-1960s. And then, like a sort of message in a bottle floating on the world's ocean that washes up on a shore and is picked up by somebody, it suddenly takes on a new life in the 1960s, and particularly when it's discovered by Glenn Gould in 1967. So I find it an extraordinary story about this ability of books to, the book itself almost has a life, and how it can transcend cultures, how it can transcend ages, and how it can touch people in radically different situations. It's also, as I'll explain a little bit later, a story with elements of tragedy in it as well. So I find it both inspirational and a little bit tragic. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about what this book is actually about, and where it came from. And then I want to tell you a little bit about how Glenn Gould came into contact with it and the effect it had on him. So if we just start off, the story of the original work, which is Kusamakura in Japanese, it literally means pillow of grass. It's the story of an artist who heads up into the mountains to escape all the hurly-burly of the cloying capitalist world below, and to lose himself in a world of what he would like to be pure artistic engagement. His purpose on the trip he's set off for, and it starts off with a famous opening line, walking up a mountain track, I fell to thinking. It's about, he's supposed to be going up into the mountains particularly to paint, though slightly comically, he manages to get to the end of the novel without actually ever painting a picture. But he certainly thinks about painting a lot, and he thinks about the artistic process a lot. It's not just about painting, it's the artist narrator also is a composer of haiku and Western style poems, so he also discusses literary matters, which you'd certainly expect from Soseki as an expert on literature. When when he goes up into the mountains, he goes to a mountain spa, and he hears the story there of a beautiful young woman called Onami, who is the daughter of the innkeeper. And Onami increasingly comes to bewitch him, essentially. He hears that she's had quite a tangled marital history. She's been married and divorced, she's lost her mother. And she is somebody who the artist narrator connects to other famous women who have been disappointed in love, and particularly the person that springs to mind is the famous picture of Ophelia by Millet. And he starts to conceive the idea that he would like to paint a picture of Onami, and Onami keeps appearing before him. Sometimes she puts on bridal clothes and appears on a veranda. Other times she suddenly appears by a pond when he's thinking about painting. And in a very famous scene, she even manages to intrude upon him in the mists of the bathroom, completely nude. So it's a sort of beautifully, slightly eroticized vision of art that the narrator is discussing. This, of course, is the famous picture of Ophelia by Millet. And the artist in Kusamakura, the original work, Pillar of Grass, he initially thinks about that in this painting he would like to do. He thinks the expression of Ophelia would be perfect for the picture of Onami he would like to do. And then he keeps reconfiguring this picture in his mind, and he starts dreaming about Onami. And this picture that he's thinking of doing keeps changing. And by the end of the story, he's actually switched to that he doesn't want the facial expression of Onami. He actually wants to paint a picture of Onami in a position like this. Somebody who, because he's heard stories of other women who, when disappointed in love, have thrown themselves into the water to commit suicide, and he thinks he will paint a picture like this, but he can't get the expression right in this mental picture he's forming of her. The artist, why he's particularly attracted to this picture is because on this journey he's making, he's attempting what he calls artistic detachment. He wants an experiment in artistry, a condition which he calls hininjo, which means looking at the world with complete detachment. So just during this short trip, he will try and look at the world as if it's an artistic phenomenon. And this particular picture pops into his mind because he thinks it has, although it's depicting something quite tragic, when you look at it, you're not bogged down with a sense of tragedy. There's actually something serene and transcendent about it. And that's the type of work that the artist is essentially looking for. And there's long discussions in the book about, particularly in Eastern literature, the ability to create works that have this sense of serenity and transcendence about them, particularly in comparison to Western works, which tend to be more Sturm und Drang and depicting the brutal realities of everyday life. So that's basically what the novel is about. It's a contemplation of art based around this story of the artist going up to the mountain spa, the story of the innkeeper's daughter, Onami, and his desire to paint this picture. I just want to explain a little bit where, in terms of Soseki, this novel came from. There's basically two parts of Natsume Soseki's biography which are represented in this novel. Natsume Soseki was born in 1867, and he was somebody who was, in his early part of his career, was to be one of Japan's leading experts in English literature. He didn't start writing as a creative writer until the age of 37 in 1904. In the early part of his career, he was working at educational institutes, which you would now think of as universities. At the time, there was only the Imperial University in Tokyo, so called a university. But the institutes he was teaching at were later to acquire the status of universities. In 1896, he is appointed a lecturer at the 5th Higher School in Kumamoto in southern Japan, on the island of Kyushu. Now, the spa that's described in The Three-Cornered World is based on a visit that Soseki made in 1897 and again in 1898, a spa that's called Owama Onsen, which is just south of Kumamoto. It has today almost entirely assumed the identity of being the spa depicted in this novel. In fact, it's quite often referred to as Kusamakura Onsen. I don't know if you're familiar with Soseki's other works, such as Botchan, which was based on Soseki's time in Matsuyama on Shikoku. But anyone who goes to Matsuyama will know it's absolutely overwhelmed with Botchan paraphernalia, and that it's enormously proud of its association with that novel. However, Soseki's novels are quite complex and subtle, and although what seems on the surface to be quite straightforward, that, for example, in Botchan he's describing Matsuyama, if you probe into it a little bit, there's a lot more complex things in it. As critics have pointed out, there's elements of Botchan that are actually based on Soseki's time in London, which happens to him later on, and I'll come to in a moment. And the same is true of this novel, although it's very closely linked to Owama Onsen in Kumamoto. As I'll explain in a moment, there's also a strong Western connection with it. But the part of it that Soseki particularly depicts in this novel that relates to him is not only his visits to this onsen just south of Kumamoto, but part of his life when he was living there. 2 months before he moved to Kumamoto in the summer of 1896, Soseki had got married, and he moves with his new wife to Kumamoto. In 1897, a year afterwards, his wife suffered a miscarriage and suffered from bouts of hysteria and actually made a suicide attempt. She threw herself into the local river and had to be hauled out by fishermen. Soseki would subsequently describe it in one of his very last works, which was a retrospective looking back on his life earlier, that he actually had to tie a rope around his wife while they were sleeping so that she wouldn't go off and do it again. So when Soseki describes in this novel this whole story of women who throw themselves into the river and drown, that he's linking with Onami, there's other characters in the novel he refers to, such as the Maid of Nagara and the Ophelia. These women who might die because of disappointment in love. He's actually describing something quite close to home, his own domestic experience. And there are elements of the novel which quite closely allude to this, such as his wife was called Kyoko, and the characters for her name meant mirror. And, for example, the pond that the artist wants to paint in the novel is called the Mirror Pond, and that's the pond that he imagines Onami floating in. So there's this whole connection between Soseki's personal life and the story he's depicting in the novel. However, Soseki, although the story seems to be set in Kumamoto and have those elements in it, There's also a very strong British connection, and this, when I come on to Glenn Gould in a moment and how he discovered it, is quite intriguing, because what starts off as seeming that Glenn Gould is connecting to an entirely Japanese world, the Japanese world of this novel actually has in it something quite Western, and it's interesting that how Glenn Gould himself then brings his Western perspective into it. So there's a sort of dynamic going on between East and West. In 1900, Soseki, at the age of 33, Soseki is chosen as a government scholar to come to London and essentially to be made into Japan's leading expert in English literature. The idea is that they want, currently in Japan, they had to use Western scholars such as Lafcadio Hearn to teach things such as English literature and many other Western sciences and arts at the universities, and they used to teach in English. The Japanese government wanted it that these academics would be replaced by their own scholars. So they said, and to do that, they think that they have to basically inculcate expertise into the creme de la creme of Japan's intelligentsia. So they choose Soseki as a government scholar and send him to London for 2 years to essentially master English literature. This puts an enormous pressure on Soseki because he doesn't actually want to go to Britain. He feels he's already too old at 33. He's married, he's got children, but he feels like he can't refuse that this is something which is being forced upon him. So he's sent over to London, and he essentially has 2 pretty miserable years in London. He finds that the money the Japanese government are giving him, though quite a lot of money in Japanese terms, doesn't translate to very much in the capital of the British Empire at the time. That's one thing. The other thing is, Soseki is obsessed with buying books, and he sees this as a fantastic opportunity when he's in London to buy up as many books as he can get his hands on. Books are expensive, even though he's buying second-hand books. He spends 1/3 of all his income in London on books, and he ends up, because of this, instead of living in the more salubrious parts of London, he ends up south of the river, moving increasingly to areas which he thinks are essentially beneath his dignity, and he sees other Japanese engineers and such like living in Kensington, and he's living in Kennington, which is a big difference for a single consonant. However, there is after 2 years, Soseki has increasingly becomes hermit-like in his behaviour. He started off, he had a tutor for the first year, but increasingly he thinks that going to classes at places like University College London are a waste of time, and that the best thing he can do is just spend all his time in his room studying. So he stays obsessively in his room reading. Doesn't want to go out, because going out equals wasting your time and spending money. This has the effect that after 2 years, he starts essentially to have a crack up. And whereas previously it was his wife who was having deep mental health problems, though she recovers from them and never had them again in her life subsequently, this time it's Soseki who starts to have intense mental health problems. And he gets paranoid. And many elements that appear in the three-cornered world reflect Soseki's mental condition from this time onwards. There's quite famous humorous passages about the artist thinking he's being pursued by detectives who are counting every time he breaks wind. This is actually based on Soseki's own experience of actually believing that people were following him on the street and watching his every behaviour. He was growing intensely paranoid. This began to be noticed in the Japanese community in London. Famously, there was supposed to be a telegram sent home to the Japanese Ministry of Education, which said, Soseki has gone mad in London, or Natsume has gone mad in London, I should say. So this was also noticed by his landlady, and he was encouraged to do things that would essentially restore his mental health. One of these things was taking up bicycle riding, which he later wrote an amusing piece about. But the key thing that he was encouraged to do, and which he did do, is he makes a trip in the UK, and he's invited up by somebody called John Henry Dixon to the Scottish Highlands for essentially a restorative holiday. And he spends about a week or 2 weeks, we're not entirely sure how long, up in Pitlochry in the Scottish Highlands. Now, subsequently, when Soseki wrote about Britain, he's essentially never got anything good to say. He refers to it as a very unpleasant 2 years. So London has this very sort of depressing, cold, dark experience for him. But the ray of light in the equation is the Scottish Highlands, because in contrast, Pitlochry in Scotland is only ever referred to in glowing terms. Soseki goes up there and he has this central communing with nature. All the cares of London are taken away, and he is wrapped in autumnal sunshine up in the great outdoors of Scotland. So what's quite an important element in this novel that he wrote is, although it appears to be quintessentially Japanese in what it's describing, the state of mind that the artist narrator has in it is exactly the state of mind that Soseki has when he goes up to Pitlochry in the Scottish Highlands. So it's a sort of mixture of a physical locale that's exclusively Japanese, based around Kumamoto, but it's a sort of mental landscape which belongs to a different place. And it's interesting that the place that Glenn Gould discovers, makes his encounter with this book, is Nova Scotia, New Scotland, in Canada. So it's actually a nice sort of linkage between these disparate worlds. If you say, what is it that Soseki's actually, why has he had this breakdown? What is it that's going on with Soseki in London? He feels enormous pressure to reward the faith put in him by the Japanese government. And in the same way as this is the age of Japanese going around the world learning industrial techniques and science and bringing it back to Japan and making Japan a modern industrial nation, in the arts as well, there's a great pressure that Japan will very quickly catch up with all the knowledge of European arts that essentially it had missed out on during its 250 years of self-imposed seclusion during the Edo period. So Soseki feels that there's pressure that he's got to do something monumental with literature. He's got to analyse what English literature is, what Western literature is. He has to bring it home, and he has to lift Japanese literature up to these same heights. This puts a considerable pressure on Soseki, not least because Soseki, although he's an expert in English literature, he has considerable interests in Japanese literature. He was a prolific composer of haiku during the 1890s. His very best friend, Masaoka Shiki, was actually Japan's leading haiku poet. And he's also a great fondness for Chinese poetry as well. So he's somebody with a very broad Catholic interest in literature. But he feels, because of the age he's in, he's being forced into, it's got to be English literature. You've got to go over there. You've got to master it. You've got to be able to come home, be the first person, the first Japanese who can teach English literature in Japan, in the same way as a Western expert would be teaching it. Under this pressure, Soseki thinks that Soseki grapples with the very idea of what is literature. And one of the problems he hits up against it is he constantly finds that his appraisal of literature is different to the appraisal of Western experts. And so when he reads a novel, because he's from a different cultural background and sensibility, what he finds interesting in that novel might not necessarily be what the appraisal of a European critic is. And he increasingly thinks, well, how can you reconcile these differences of both of opinion and of the works themselves? How can you actually get some sort of objective view of what literature is? He famously says that trying to read literary works to get to the bottom of literature is like washing blood with blood. And so he hits on a different course, which is that he is going to massively expand his parameters of study. So he's not going to just be the expert in English literature. He wants to actually get to the very heart of what literature is. And to do that, he feels that he has to read books on philosophy, psychology, fine arts. He's reading even books on sexologies, of social science, evolution. So he wants to create something quite revolutionary. And he produces a quite monumental work, which is called The Theory of Literature. It's really interesting that at virtually the same time that Soseki is writing The Theory of Literature, which is this sort of massive sort of reconfiguration of the fundamental nature of literature. There are all these ideas going on in the world of science, most famously Einstein's theories of relativity, that would sort of like smash through into new appraisals of what, of our understanding of the relative natures of space and time. Soseki's theory is also absolutely about relativity. But it's ahead of the game in that sense. He's producing this slightly before Einstein comes out with his physics theories. It's both a sort of quantum theory of consciousness, and it's also a macro theory about literature in general. And he starts off from the very smallest iotas of consciousness, of asking what is it when we perceive the world, what is it that we're perceiving, how does it change second by second. So he starts off from the very sort of subatomic level of existence, and he fans it out from there into a contemplation of, across ages, across cultures, what is this thing that we call literature? Why is it important? And why is it that according to different ages, our understanding and our taste in literature differ? The relative element of it is, his way into this is to say that essentially literature has two elements. That there's the narrative content, which he calls big F, written with a capital letter, and the mood which the writer applies to that narrative, which he calls little f. So in other words, if you have the same story, you can radically change the nature of that story according to the way you write it. You can tell a story in such a way that it appears as an epic, a satire, a comedy. You can make it poetic, you can make it plain. You can do all types of things with the same narrative according to the narrative, the mood you apply to it. You'll see actually on the picture on the right, Soseki, you'd think if you were looking at some of the illustrations he puts in this book, you'd almost think you were reading like a physics treatise or something, the ideas he's producing with it. And to having set up those ideas of relativity in literature, he then brings into play an exhaustive application of analysis of different literary techniques, of all the different things writers can do to make the narrative interesting, to create effects in the story. So it's quite an amazing piece of monumental philosophy and literary analysis. He's particularly taken because of the relative structures he set up in the book of the idea between narrative content and mood. He's particularly interested in setups where there's a contrast between the story the author is telling and the mood that's applied to it. So, for example, a famous example is the porter scene in Macbeth. There's, in a scene of grisly murder, Shakespeare brings in a moment of comic relief, and famously this was to accentuate the sense of dread in the scene. But Soseki was also very alert to these contrasts between what he calls big F and little f, narrative and mood. This will come back into play when we come on to Glenn Gould in a moment. So when Soseki goes back to Tokyo and he starts lecturing, he already has beneath him an enormous hinterland of research and critical theory that he's built up, particularly during his time in London. At the end of 1904, he's still suffering from mental health problems, and he's also under considerable pressure. And he ends up teaching at 3 different institutions, and the number of his children is rapidly increasing. By 1906, he had 4 children, and he eventually had 7 children. So he feels a great pressure both on a domestic front. He's got a lot of mouths to feed, and he also feels that there's constant pressure that he's got to produce something, worthy of the government investment to him. He's still suffering from mental health problems. At the end of 1904, he's encouraged again to sort of alleviate his condition. Why doesn't he actually have a go at writing some fiction? And he produces what he intends as a short story called I Am a Cat, which is a comic satire, a cat's perspective on the world, which is, of course, a classic piece of the sort of relativistic vision that he's bringing to play. It's enormous success. It takes off immediately, and he's encouraged to keep writing it, and he does keep writing it, and suddenly it's as if the floodgates open, and he writes more and more and more. And so only having started in 1904, by the time we get to this book being written in 1906, I refer in the introduction which I wrote to this book 4 years ago, as 1906 was really literature's miracle year. This is 1905 was Einstein's miracle year, when he suddenly produces all these extraordinary papers on physics. In the case of Soseki, 1906 is the year where he's essentially producing 4 masterpieces. He finishes up I Am a Cat, he writes Kusamakura, he writes Botchan, which is probably the most wildly popular modern Japanese novel that there is, and he writes another realistic novel called Nawaki, the Autumn Wind. And he writes them with incredible speed and extraordinary ease. So this book, for example, he wrote in the space of 2 weeks. He also wrote Botchan in the space of 2 weeks. He's writing as an amateur writer because he's got a day job at three educational institutions. So quite extraordinary that he's able to do this. But the point about it is, when he's writing these books, because he's got this amazing background, all these ideas are surging forth from him. And he's able to transform these extremely complex philosophical ideas through an incredibly poetic consciousness, but also an enormous wit and gift for humour and empathy, and produce something that is at once enormously profound, but yet fascinating and compulsively readable, which is really the secret of Soseki's genius, that he's able to combine these elements of philosophical profundity with I guess a sort of innate ability to write fantastically well. So, 1906, he produces this book, still as an amateur. It's really his breakthrough book, because when it's produced in September of 1906, it sells out within 10 days, and it attracts the attention of the editors of the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's leading newspapers. And they recognize his genius and ask him if he would like to become their in-house novelist, so to become a professional novelist, writing day in, day out novels that would be serialized for the newspaper. And Soseki, after a lot of quibbling about terms and whatever, then stuns the Japanese academic world by giving up this hugely prestigious position at the Imperial University and becoming the Asahi Shimbun's novelist. And from there on, he then goes on to produce a whole array of classics, which are really the bedrock of modern Japanese literature, probably the finest works in modern Japanese literature. So, both in Soseki's own career, this book, Kusamakura, is absolutely key, and it's gone on to be an enshrined classic in Japan, loved over the generations. But it was also, of course, still unknown in the West. Soseki dies in 1916, and his books carry on being massive bestsellers. The publisher who brought them out, Iwanami, in fact, made his fortune on the back of Soseki's novels. But 50 years after Soseki's death, we're still waiting for it to come out in English. So, let's move the scene to swinging London, 1960s. In 1965, a 26-year-old Englishman called Alan Turney decides that he wants to bring out this classic novel. One of the extraordinary things about Alan Turney's translation was that Turney had actually only started learning Japanese 6 years earlier, and anybody who knows the original novel, Kusamakura, will know that it's one of the most densely poetic and difficult works to translate. Really quite extraordinary that an Englishman at the age of 26 could have the chutzpah to put this into English. But he's somebody who had discovered the novel, had actually written his PhD at SOAS on it, and had a real deeply ingrained love for it, which is always the best situation for a classic translation. This on the right is how the book appears in English in 1965. And of course you'll notice that it's not actually got any obvious signs of its Japanese roots in it. This is the age of, I always think when I look at that there, it looks like the beginning of one of those Bond films. I feel like James Bond is going to appear in the middle of that. It's the age of Goldfinger and the Pink Panther and things like that, and it's essentially brought out in as a kind of a piece of quirky Eastern exotica, because again the audience don't know who Natsume Soseki is. I should say that in 1957 there'd been a translation of Kokoro, a very different novel, and the translation tended to present Soseki as quite a somber, serious figure. My own view is that Kokoro is actually much more satirical than critics have tended to praise it. But when this book is come out, this is as if it's a completely different writer. It's intensely poetical language, and it's absolutely brimming with wit and style. I should say as well, interestingly about its timing, a key element in the book is when the artist goes up into the mountains, off stage, though still very much felt, is the Russo-Japanese War. And the novel kind of concludes with the idea that to escape the what's going on in the world below is ultimately an impossibility. That some of the characters in the novel are actually sucked off by train off to the war in Manchuria at the end of the book. And it's very interesting in terms of timing when this book comes out in English. It's just that time when the Vietnam War is about to increase. And it appears very much as a sort of countercultural book. A lot of the ideas in it that are the contemplation of art are very much in tune with the late 1960s society. For example, one of the ideas the artist has is that to be an artist, you don't actually have to produce a work of art, you just have to think as an artist. Somebody who has a single artistic thought is an artist. And he's also saying in it, the narrator, that it's a real statement of intent in some ways. He's saying that to be an artist is to be more important than the people who lust after power or money, and that having that artistic sensibility is the most important thing of all. So in the world of 1960s London that this book appears in, when we're just getting rid of all that 1950s fustiness, when a big anti-war movement is building up, it's fantastic timing, and it's like a book out of nowhere, that people can relate to in their own circumstances, but which is a fascinating story of its own. 2 years later, 1967, Canada. Glenn Gould is taking a train trip. He's been on a vacation to Nova Scotia. Gould is at this time already, and he's been retired from performing in public for several years, and is already well known for his various quirks as well as his genius. He's spotted in the club car of a train by a professor of chemistry called William Foley, who plucks up the courage to go up to him and engage him in conversation. At the end of this meeting, Gould presents Foley with a record of his recording of Beethoven's piano concerto. Afterwards, Foley, for whatever reason we don't know, sends to Gould a copy of this book, The Three-Cornered World. I should say, incidentally, that the title of the book had been chosen by Turney. Thought that Pillow of Grass was not something which the English-speaking public would understand. So he decides he'll come up with his own title, and he takes it from from inside the book, there's a section where the artist narrator says that the artist is somebody who lives in a world where the corner of common sense has been taken out. So that's the three-cornered world that it's referring to in the title. So Foley sends this book to Gould. And this is really just by this chance circumstance where Gould's whole obsession subsequently with Soseki takes flight. Previously, Gould's favourite novel had been The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. But now, once he reads The Three-Cornered World, it completely replaces The Magic Mountain in his affection. I should also say there's a very neat liaison between the manner in which Gould comes into contact with this book and the actual close of the book itself, because in Kusamakura, there's a famous description at the end of the book where it actually ends with the artist narrator at a train station with Onami waving off one of her relatives and catching sight of her ex-husband, which provides the expression on her face that completes his mental picture. But Soseki puts in it a description of the train as he says nothing so symbolises this modern world that we live in as the train, because it picks everyone up and it throws them along at thunderous speed, all in a mass. And he's actually quite prophetic in this, because it would of course be the train which would be the engine of the great wars that were about to break out across Europe. But it's also nicely ironic that it's on exactly the train that Glenn Gould would have the encounter that this book then enters his universe. What is it about the book that so engages Gould's interest? I would say it is that Gould, having rocketed to success at such an early age as a fantastically technically proficient virtuoso, and having done the whole rounds of adulation around the world, starts to turn away from his earlier sort of showboating of talent. For many people, to reach the sort of technical proficiency that Gould is able to get to, the fantastically fast, precise playing, would be sort of like a lifelong goal. But it's essentially like Gould's genius as a pianist, because he's able to get there so early. As he gets older, he wants to sort of go beyond that. That what many people would take as the ultimate goal as a pianist is not enough for him, and he wants to do something where he gets to a more transcendent, profound sense of what music is. I think that Gould was profoundly attracted to the artistic treatise that the narrator in this novel proposes, that this longing for an art that is transcendent and serene. Gould famously, on occasion, would be alarmingly dismissive of Chopin and occasionally Mozart as sort of artists that appealed to a kind of cloying sentimentality. Gould is really looking to get beyond that, and he's a famous lover of Bach, because he thinks that Bach doesn't do this appealing to a slightly sort of lower level of popularity. He's a more transcendent figure. So I think that the book really appeals to this side of Gould that wants to create this serene, transcendent vision of art. But I think there's another important aspect of it as well, is that Gould has this wonderfully sort of satirical and comical side, and that he found this exactly mirrored in the book as well. So that not only is this a book that, on the one hand, is talking about serenity and transcendence, but you could have it that it would be insufferable if it did that it would be pretentious. But instead, Soseki, as a writer, has this wonderfully sort of dialectical side to him, that he's always sort of proposing ideas, and on the other hand, undermining them, seeing the comic side of them, re-evaluating them. So, for example, Soseki was very attracted to Zen, and Zen features repeatedly in Soseki's novels. But there's also a kind of comic undermining of sort of Zen-like thought as well. There isn't all this talk of otherworldliness. When it gets down to it, don't you actually find that you are attached to this world? That it's not that you can't live in this lofty otherworldliness. And he repeatedly satirises figures that sort of spout forth this thing. So I think that the book is wonderfully appealing to Glenn Gould on these two levels. That on the one hand it represents absolutely his ambition to get to this transcendent heart of art, but it also manages to do it in this wonderfully light, rich, amusing and self-deprecating way. And Gould himself, at the same time as aiming for this re-evaluation of his performances, was also himself a considerable comic talent when he's writing about the pomposity of the classical musical world. I said at the beginning there were elements of tragedy in this story, and I want to tell you what those are, because I think it's very significant that in December 1981, Gould undertakes his re-recording of the Goldberg Variations, the work that had rocketed into fame at the age of 22. In that very same month, Gould records on Canadian radio a broadcast of the opening chapter of The Three-Cornered World. Now that isn't, in my opinion, a coincidence. This is sort of like a wrestling with art that Gould had undertaken, and that his sort of reappraisal of where he wants to get to as an artist, I think, is wrapped up with this lifelong dialogue that he's having with The Three-Cornered World. He'd been intending that the following, shortly afterwards, he would take this yet a step further, and that he would produce a radio play of this. So he actually wanted to produce a work himself based on this book. Unfortunately, at the age of 50, Gould died of a stroke. I think it's very sad that he wasn't able to live longer and really achieve some of the things he wanted to do with this book, because it's a fantastic opportunity for a genius like Gould to have actually introduced the greatest writer of Japanese modern literature to the West. And it was cruelly robbed by Gould's death at that time. The other, for me, quite sad and tragic part of the story is that Alan Turney, who had sort of burst out as a fresh-faced translator at the age of 26, produces only one other translation afterwards. He translates in 1972 Botchan, and that is it. He doesn't translate anything else, and he died at the age of 68 in 2006. I've always thought that was a great shame, because to see somebody like Turney burst out with this, and to see it go into the hands of Gould, and to have such an impact on such an important figure, really makes me inspired with what art can do. And I can fully understand that Alan Turney must have felt that his labours on these projects must have been very unrewarded. It must have been very hard work to produce these translations, and he probably thought that he was getting very little in return for them. But I think it's one of the magical unknowns of books, that you kind of never know, you never ultimately know where they're going to lead to and what their subsequent life is going to be. I just want to finish with when this book was released re-released in 2011. I wrote quite a long introduction to it, and touching on quite a lot of the subjects I've been discussing today, and including Glenn Gould's fascination with it. But when we redid it, one of the things we did with it was the books in the series were all accompanied by really interesting frontispieces by the Japanese artist Mrs. Kusaka. This, to me, in many ways, symbolises a lot of what I find fascinating about a work like Kusamakura, The Three-Cornered World. I think one of the things she's representing here is these are all representations of the characters of the book, but all undergone a sort of artistic transformation. One of the ideas that Soseki was getting to in his great sort of theory of literary relativity was that literature is always something which is being constantly reinterpreted and being reborn in your consciousness. That in a way you can never reread the same book twice. That every time you read a book, that you engage with it, it's in some way reborn in your mind in a new way according to the circumstances you're living in, the culture that's surrounding you, your experiences, etc. And so, for a book like Kusamakura, it's being endlessly sort of reborn on the stream of an individual's consciousness, and indeed in the sort of stream of consciousness of the culture as a whole. And I think one of the things she was brilliantly captures in this is these ideas of a sort of stream of their characters which are going through these constant transformations which all art does, and which Gould himself brought to bear on his own constant reinterpretations of the musical works he was engaged in, such as Bach's Goldberg variations. She rather cleverly, I thought, left off in a nod to this. She leaves off the top corner, so that there becomes like one constant, that the three-cornered world is something which, in the artistic vision, is something which will always lack this corner of pedestrian common sense. It's being born and reborn within your own imagination, according to your capacity to connect it to your own experiences and the culture around you. I hope in some way tonight I've explained how this book, I think, was extremely important to Glenn Gould, and not just on a personal level, but in his actual career as a musician. And I'm hoping you're going to ask me some very difficult musical questions that I can't answer. Thank you very much.